Hi, my name is Malcolm Clemens Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, California, and welcome to the online forum. We're so glad that you're joining us tonight. Every year, the Cathedral chooses a theme to reflect on, and in 2020, our theme is bridges. So we chose it long before we found out that isolation was going to be a major issue in the year 2020, but it was a good choice. Throughout the year, we have been exploring how we form connections with people and how we can reach across real or perceived divides. For the next 3 weeks of the forum, we're going to be talking about justice from three different perspectives: from that of a former prisoner, from a scholar, and tonight from the District Attorney of San Francisco, responsible for prosecution of criminal violations of state and local law. Chesa Boudin began serving as District Attorney of San Francisco in January of this year. He was previously a public defender, and he is committed to the progressive prosecution movement. How can this movement help build bridges that promote justice and safety in our community? Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're very glad. We know you're very busy, and we're glad you have the time for us.
Thank you, Malcolm. It's great to be with you, and I'm glad we were able to coordinate.
Yeah, me too. Definitely. I kept thinking as I was going through, my little frustrations today, what your frustrations must be. They're the much larger size frustrations, I imagine.
Yes, big problems, often impossible decisions to make, and sometimes problems for which we really haven't developed good solutions yet. But we do the best we can every day, and it's a real honor to be able to serve the city in this way.
Yeah, and I think that's part of why we're so excited about tonight's conversation. Is just, as best practices evolve in policing and criminal justice and the law, it's just good to be talking to somebody who thinks a lot about those questions. When you grew up, your parents were both in prison, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just what that was like for you as a kid, when you found out, and just kind of what that whole story was, and what it's come to mean for the kind of the trajectory of your life.
Absolutely. When I was an infant, my parents dropped me off at the babysitter, and they went to participate as drivers in an armed robbery. The robbery went wrong, and tragically 3 men were killed, 2 of them police officers. Of course, my parents never came back to get me at the babysitter that day. And my mother went on to serve a 22-year prison sentence. My father is still incarcerated today, nearly 40 years later, and he may never get out. Yeah. As a result of what my parents did, I ended up, of course, having a life turned upside down. I was traumatized. I didn't have a family for a period of time. And ultimately, I was adopted by friends of my parents. I don't remember that, but my earliest memories are going through steel gates and metal detectors just to be able to see my parents, to be able to give them a hug. And I've been visiting them ever since. Years, now decades of visiting jails and prisons really profoundly impacted my development and my worldview. It taught me the hard way how broken our criminal justice system is, how much it's failing to heal the harm that crime victims suffer, how much it's failing to rehabilitate people who have caused harm, and how it's really not making us safer, but instead creating a cycle of crime and intergenerational incarceration. Because of that experience, when I went to law school, I knew I wanted to work in the criminal justice system, to make it more just, to make it more effective at accomplishing the goals that all of us share when it comes to safety and justice. Out of law school, I started working as a public defender. And now, as you said, I run the San Francisco District Attorney's Office and have the great privilege to serve the entire city in thinking about ways we can be smarter and more effective in our response to crime, more humane, more restorative, and not punitive for the sake of retribution, but rather ensuring that the kind of accountability we seek actually helps victims move forward with their lives, and also helps ensure that when people who have been convicted of a crime are released, they have the skills and the structures necessary to avoid reoffending.
The people who I've visited, friends who've been incarcerated, in that setting, there's so much despair because there are people who will be there forever, and there are people who will ultimately get out. But there's just such a strong sense that that society has thrown away these people. And I wonder just, how do we change that? How do we begin to like see the humanity of the people in the prison system, and make progress in this? Because, I just think of, even when things are happening outside the political system, when there's a budget crisis, for instance, it has all these ramifications for prisoners. And I look at almost anything that happens on the outside and just think, well, what's going to happen, if Donald Trump gets reelected for people who are in the prison system? But I wonder, what you think about some of those questions, just because you're so much closer to it and you've been, through going and visiting part of that system for so much longer of a period of time.
Absolutely. My father's still incarcerated, as I said. And so the people we prosecute in San Francisco, the people in California State Prison, I will never be able to see them just as a criminal defendant or just as another case number. They're always going to be real three-dimensional human beings with families, with communities, with hopes and dreams, people who are more than their worst mistakes. For me, it's personal. It always will be, because I've grown up visiting my loved ones behind bars. And I recognize that while my parents did something really horrific and appropriately were held accountable for what they did, they are not defined simply by that one day or that one act. That's something that is a really important part of my work, is remembering the need to have compassion for everybody who's caught up in the system. It's not just the people we prosecute and send to jail and prison who are, who lose their humanity in our criminal justice system. It's also crime victims who are often treated as nothing more than a piece of evidence, who are used to secure a conviction, but not given restitution or support or therapy by our criminal justice system, not given the tools to really put the trauma behind them and move forward. And so one of the challenges for me in a system with all of the bureaucratic pressures and all of the litigation demands as our criminal justice system is to remember the humanity and to lead with compassion in every single case. That's something I try to do personally, and I try hard to instill that value and that perspective in my staff.
I read your letters from young activists, and it was really helpful. It was almost like, it's like a different you, because it's at a different stage of your life. But in a way, there's a part of your parents' life that's connected to policing, the criminal justice system, the law. But there's also kind of like that political element, which you're definitely in touch with at the time that you wrote the letter. That's, the first letter in that book. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that too, because that's another way in which your parents' life has influenced you, even if it was you weren't able to see them on a daily basis.
It has been a long time since I've seen the cover of that book, so it's a bit of a blast from the past. I think I edited. It came out, I think, in 2004, if I remember.
Yeah, that's exactly right. But don't you still love the project? It's just, it's just.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a ton of fun to work on that project. I met a group of great young people who, and for folks who aren't familiar with it, it's an epistolary volume, meaning it's a collection of letters. And we brought together a group of young activists. Everyone was under the age of 30. One was under the age of 10. And we shared stories and visions about organizing and agitating for a better world. And we brought together people from very different movements, people who were working on criminal justice reform for sure, but also environmental activism and indigenous rights and racial solidarity and a wide range of other social justice movements, fair trade, international solidarity issues. And we tried to create a space for people to think critically about the history of social movements in this country, looking backwards at the 1960s and 70s, with trying to build bridges, the theme of tonight's conversation, with in between movements that were active in that moment that we wrote the book, and also trying to kind of dialogue with the future about what sort of a world we wanted to build, what sort of people we wanted to be when we no longer could call ourselves young. And it was a really fun project. You're absolutely right that I had, because of my upbringing and who my parents were, a really concrete and in some ways essential conversation with previous movements, social justice movements, movements for social and political change, because my parents came out of the civil rights movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement, and their activism in those movements is what ultimately led to their participation in that tragically bungled armed robbery back in 1981. So that was something I grew up with, thinking about and trying to make sense of how my parents, who I knew had been motivated by fundamentally good intentions, could have been led so far astray and ended up participating in something that was not only criminal, but also really tragic in the consequences it had, primarily for those three families that lost their father, but also for me and for so many others who were indirectly victimized by their decisions. So yeah, it's something I've been thinking about in different ways my whole life, and something I've been talking to my parents and extended family about since before I can remember.
What did your dad say when you told him that you were interested in doing this work?
My biological father is like a lot of fathers in their 70s, mid 70s. He's proud of me. He's always a little bit nervous about how I'm going to be able to juggle all of the responsibilities of my professional life with some of my family obligations, and he wants the best for me. And he recognized that running for office was going to expose me and all of our family to a tremendous amount of hatred and vitriol and attacks. He recognized that the criminal justice system is so profoundly failed in its conception, in its organization, in its structures, that it may be a bigger task to fix it than any one person is capable of. So I think he expressed those concerns primarily. He also made the point, that his prison's full enough. He doesn't really need me sending more people there. Of course, he's in New York and I'm in California, so it was a figurative rather than a literal comment. But I think fundamentally he understands that it's an area that's absolutely crying out for reform and for rethinking our approach. And he, like a lot of fathers, is proud of me and kind of believes, perhaps naively, but believes that I can do anything I set my mind to. So he was supportive, as he always has been, even from the distance his incarceration creates.
Yeah. Last week, our guest was Joan Williams from Hastings Law School, and she was talking, and she said during the course of our conversation that walking around downtown San Francisco reminded her of Venezuela in the 1960s. And as soon as she said that, I thought of you and your connection with Venezuela. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just like what you saw there and how that informs how you understand what's happening here too. Because in some ways, I think if you haven't been outside of the system, it's hard to have a clear picture of exactly what's unique about California, American politics, and what's true of just human nature all around the world.
I've been really lucky in that before going to law school, and to some extent since, I've been able to travel and live abroad. I learned fluent Spanish, Portuguese, traveled all over the world. And one of the regions I've spent the most time in is Latin America. My wife is from Chile, born in Chile. I studied abroad in Chile. And as you say, I spent quite a bit of time in Venezuela. It's probably the country outside the US that I spent the most time in. Spent several years there doing research for my Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford, working as a freelance journalist, and also working as an interpreter and a translator. I ended up translating a book from Spanish to English. It was the first full-length interview with then President Hugo Chavez that had been done in Spanish, published in Spanish, and I was hired by a US publisher to do the translation into English. So I had a really amazing experience living there and watching a country in the sort of 2004 to 2006 period, a country in the midst of a really dramatic social and political transformation. Venezuela is a country, and we could spend hours talking about it. I wrote a master's thesis at Oxford about Venezuelan oil politics. I taught a class of Yale College undergraduates on Venezuelan public policy issues. But it's a country that, like so much of Latin America, has tremendous natural wealth and resources, but also has been devastated by generation after generation of corruption and failure to manage its own resources, and also intervention by other countries and a legacy of colonialism and imperialism, all of which continue to manifest in complicated ways. I wasn't in Venezuela in the 1960s. I wasn't alive, so I can't compare with what it might have been like then. But I can tell you that when I lived there, it was a country with absolute horrific poverty and had a very serious problem with homelessness and visible consumption of drugs, violence, often with total impunity. And there are some similarities between the worst parts of downtown Caracas and the worst parts of the Tenderloin, say, today in San Francisco. But there's also so many fundamental differences. You know, Venezuela is a country that, when President Chavez took office in 1999, had just generational deficits in terms of basic literacy and access to healthcare. San Francisco, for all of our problems, is doing way better in terms of access to resources and just the wealth that exists in this country for basic social safety nets. At the same time, there was a really intense concerted effort to attack extreme poverty. And the Venezuelan government at that time spent billions of dollars, mostly in windfalls from oil sales, to try to create literacy programs, public health programs, access to food and basic nutrition programs in a way that had never really been seen before in Venezuela. And I think, you know, we have a lot of work to do in San Francisco, particularly given the resources at our disposal, given that we're one of the wealthiest cities in the history of the planet, to make sure that basic human dignities like toilets are accessible to everybody. You know, when I was on the campaign trail, a lot of people criticized me for saying I would not prosecute quality of life crimes. But, you know, to me, the solution to people using the toilet on the street is not to prosecute them. It's to make sure there's access to public toilets 24/7. The solution to people saying we're frustrated with tents all over our city is not to prosecute people criminally for setting up tents, but rather to build more homeless shelters and more capacity. I think it's a fundamentally, you know, regardless of your religious framework, it's a fundamentally moral thing to do. It's a fundamentally human thing to do, is to say, how can we solve the problem, not how can we punish you for the symptom of the problem. And I think we have a lot of work to do in San Francisco in that regard.
Yeah, me too. It breaks my heart when I try to tell my children what it was like, you know, 20, 30, 40 years ago. And it's almost like describing a different place. The settings changed so much. Inequality's gotten so much more pronounced, and poverty's gotten so much worse too. When you became the district attorney, like, what surprised you the most when you first began your work and when you took office? I mean, you probably had an imagination about, you probably imagined what it was like before, and then how'd that match up with what your actual experience was of the work?
I've always been happiest and most productive in a steep learning curve environment, and that's certainly what this year has been, both taking over a new office and trying to navigate some of the challenges of any city bureaucracy. Inevitably learning curves about the budget process and the HR challenges and some of the staffing issues, but also trying to figure out how to do all that in the context of COVID-19. And obviously nobody could have predicted the challenges, but I feel like we individually and collectively as a city have done a phenomenal job navigating this unprecedented crisis. And it's been a source of inspiration and pride for me to see how my staff step up and make adjustments on the fly in order to continue doing our job, continue to seek justice, continue to move cases forward, mindful of the constitutional rights of the people we're prosecuting, as well as of the people who have been harmed by the crimes that we're alleging in our cases. You know, to your question about what surprised me the most, so many things surprised me. You know, the problems are pretty obvious to anyone who pays attention, but finding solutions is not. If it were easy, if there were any magic bullet to the challenges we see every day in our criminal courts, then I think we would have solved the problems a long time ago. And so I think, you know, that's just something that I'm constantly surprised by, is how challenging building real solutions is and how much resistance there is to change from folks who have a front row seat to see how broken our approach is, and yet There's a lot of people a lot of institutions, a lot of agencies that will not allow us to move forward or be creative with our approach.
Yeah, I can imagine. COVID probably opens up some opportunities for you, as well as makes certain basic ways of working impossible. I wonder if you can talk about that a little bit. If there's anything that COVID's helped you to really move forward on. I know that's true. In our cathedral, we basically for the last 5 years have been saying we're going to do way more things online, and really moving kind of slowly on it. But once the governor's stay-at-home order happened, we learned really quickly how to do those things that we've been meaning to do for a while.
What's the old saying? Necessity is the mother of creativity,
right?
And mother invention. And that's certainly been true for our office. For about a decade now, there's been an effort to redo our data system, to make a lot of the work that our staff do every day possible from home. Not just because of things like COVID, but also we want our staff to be able to get work done. If they have family needs, if they need to go home and put their kids to bed, we don't want them to then have to come back into the office to finish preparing for a trial or to be able to answer a question from a victim that may come in after hours. So for many years before I took office, there was an effort to facilitate remote access to our databases. And it just hadn't happened for a variety of reasons. We had a situation very early in the COVID pandemic where one of my staff members was exposed to COVID through a face-to-face conversation with a police officer who later tested positive. And that event really put us over the edge. I have to take the safety and well-being of my staff extremely seriously. It has to be a priority for me. We can't do our basic constitutional function to serve the people of San Francisco if our staff are sick. And so we made some immediate changes that probably wouldn't have been possible but for that kind of necessity, but for that realization that my staff were putting themselves on the line every day. And in a very short period of time, we transitioned to a primarily electronic rebooking process and to give access to our staff to work from home. A large number of our staff are now pretty much exclusively working from home, at least during this pandemic. That was a huge shift that probably would have taken years, but for the pandemic. There's another one that's a little bit less bureaucratic and administrative and a little bit, I think, closer to the heart of the challenges that we face as a city and how we navigate public safety issues. I ran for district attorney last year on a platform focused on reducing our addiction to incarceration, on ending mass incarceration, because I understood that being the country in the world that incarcerates the most people is not a good thing. It doesn't actually use our resources wisely. It doesn't actually build strong communities or enhance public safety in the long run. What I didn't fully appreciate as a candidate a year ago was all of the ways in which mass incarceration also jeopardizes public health, and the ways in which really all of us, directly or indirectly, are connected to jails and prisons in this country. Turns out the majority of adult Americans have an immediate family member who is either currently or formerly incarcerated. And it turns out there's over 1 million people in this country who go into a prison or jail every day to work as a correctional officer. That doesn't even include all of the public health staff that work in jails and prisons, all of the janitors and all of the vendors who go in to provide services. All of us, in one way or another, are vulnerable when jails or prisons become hotspots for COVID-19. And we've seen that happen in San Quentin, here in Marin, in the Bay Area. We've seen it happen in Ohio in Marion Prison, in Cook County in the jail in Chicago, in Rikers Island, the jail in New York City. In fact, more than half of the largest hotspots for COVID outbreaks in the country have been jails and prisons. And very early in the pandemic, the director of jail medical services wrote a public letter to me and the other justice partners in San Francisco saying that if we could not quickly reduce the jail population, she was going to be unable to keep the people in her charge safe and healthy in the context of COVID. And that lit the fire under all of us in a way that nothing had for years. And we reduced the jail population by about 40% between the high point in January to the low point during the pandemic. It was an extraordinary accomplishment that also, and this is a really important point, that also was accompanied by falling crime rates. There are a lot of people who say, if you let them out of jail, crime's going to go up. The people in jail need to be in jail. And I was never so sure that was true for all of them. I always believed we could safely decarcerate, but COVID gave us the imperative. And we've seen the jail population fall by 40%. And in the same period, we've seen San Francisco overall reported crime drop by more than 20%.
Yeah, my daughter has an internship at the public defender's office in New York City, which is possible to do from California now.
Right.
But she's right on the front lines of learning about that. I wanted to change the subject a little bit to talk a little bit about policing reform. It's something we talked about so much during the early part of the summer, and I just haven't heard very much about that recently. And I wonder if you could talk about just what are the most important parts of policing reform, and just what your relationship is like with police officers in San Francisco.
Well, we work really closely with the police department. It's the only it's the primary law enforcement agency in San Francisco, compared to other jurisdictions that have maybe 10 or 15 different police departments. We've got one. And sure, we work with the sheriff every day and highway patrol and BART police, but our primary investigative law enforcement partner in the vast majority of criminal cases we prosecute is the San Francisco Police Department. We have to find ways to work together, and we have to find ways to work together better than we have. And I'll be the first to say, police have a nearly impossible job. There are tremendous expectations of what they'll accomplish, tremendous risks on a daily basis, and they're also under a microscope with everything they do being recorded, being videotaped, being scrutinized. Last year, the San Francisco Police Department responded to approximately 1 million calls for service. It is a huge job. And in many ways, we're asking police to do too much. We're asking them to do more than is fair or than their resources allow. At the same time, we need them to do a better job with their core function of preventing and investigating serious and violent crimes. We know that there's a real deficit when it comes to trust between communities and law enforcement. We know across the country, we've seen it in the protests in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And one of my goals coming into office was not just to build a better relationship between the DA and the police department. That's certainly needed, and it still is, but also to ensure that our communities in San Francisco that are impacted by crime have more trust and confidence and are more willing to cooperate with law enforcement. I'll give you a concrete example. We have a shooting that occurred in San Francisco this summer where a young child was accidentally, I believe, shot and killed. Everybody in the community says they know exactly who was involved in the shooting, but the police haven't made an arrest, and it's been some 4 months since that happened. We need people to feel comfortable, to feel safe, to feel trust enough to come forward and cooperate, or we won't be able to solve crimes that are otherwise solvable. It's for that reason, among others, that I've taken really concrete steps around policies that are within my control to try and intervene and take action to rebuild trust and to limit the kind of racial bias that we know is a constant feature of policing in so many parts of this country. So I'll give you one concrete example. For more than 20 years, there's been really rigorous studies that have looked at every single traffic stop, every single bike or pedestrian stop by San Francisco Police Department and other agencies across the state. And they found consistently for more than 20 years that there is a really clear racial bias in who gets stopped. You're much more likely to get stopped by police in San Francisco, even as compared to other jurisdictions, if you're Black or brown, than if you look like me. And once you're stopped, you're more likely to get searched with or without your consent. Now, most of those searches, the vast majority, do not lead to any criminal charges or any contraband or anything criminal related, but they do tremendous damage, humiliating people, undermining them in front of their families. I've heard so many stories of people saying, I can't keep getting stopped in front of my customers. I run a small business, and when the police stop me and pull me out of the car and search me, I lose business, and my kids lose respect for me, and it's humiliating. It does so much damage to the broader goal of public safety and community-based policing, and so little to actually promote the goals of public safety and law enforcement. I made the decision in February of this year to simply stop filing criminal charges in cases, contraband cases that stem from that kind of stop and frisk style policing. We know that Black and brown communities are really frustrated, are really angry with the way they've been treated with these kinds of policing tactics. The Obama Department of Justice wrote a report in 2016 making hundreds of recommendations for the San Francisco Police Department to implement reforms. Many of those recommendations pertained to this approach to stop and frisk style pre-textual traffic stops of Black and brown community members. And the changes weren't made. 4 years later, in the first quarter of 2020, the racial disparities in traffic stops were just as bad as they were when the Obama Department of Justice wrote its report. I can't be complicit in massive civil rights violations, and I need to take action and implement policies that will help push the police towards making these sorts of necessary changes. So that's one example. I could give you half a dozen others of concrete things we've done this year to try and help move towards more transparency and more accountability, so that the majority of police, the ones who are out there doing a difficult job and doing it well every day, can get the credit they deserve and the trust we need them to have.
Yeah, it's so many times when I hear in the news about the worst cases, I just think the training, what the practices are, what the habits are, the traditions of how you do law enforcement, and just it does seem like at every level, it's just things need to change in order for everyone to feel safe and for everyone to feel like the police are working for them too. I want to change subjects again, and one of the things that I remember most about your campaign was about changing the bail system, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that tonight, just like what's important to change about the bail system, and then what you've done in terms of your work on it.
Sure, I'll jump into that in a second. I just want to, I see, I'm not able to follow all of the Q&A in the box, but I saw there was one question about crime rates. I did just try to put a link to the data that is the source for those falling crime rates into the Q&A box. For folks who are curious about it, it's really interactive. You can select by district, you can select by date, you can look at different categories of crime. And one thing to be aware of is it's just comparing this year to last year. It doesn't look at longer historic trends, and it has nothing to do with how many cases police make arrests in or how many cases we prosecute. It's just based on reported crime. So it's a pretty good comparison of what we saw last year and what we're seeing this year without regard to policing trends or prosecution trends. It's just reported crime. Back to your question though, Malcolm, on bail reform, one of the things that I ran my campaign, really focused on was ending the role of wealth-based disparities in the criminal justice system. I think it's absolutely unacceptable, both from a public safety standpoint and from an equal protection under law standpoint, to have pretrial detention determined by wealth. And for folks who aren't familiar, let me just explain briefly how the money bail system works. If you get arrested and booked into jail, even before my office decides whether to charge you with a crime, under a traditional money bail system, if you're wealthy, you can immediately buy your way out of jail. If you're poor, you stay in custody until we decide there's not enough evidence to prosecute you, or until you appear in front of a judge, maybe 3 or 4 days later, depending on when you're arrested, and the judge allows you to be released. And in some instances, a judge may leave bail in place. And if you're poor, you may stay in jail for months or years while you wait for trial. There's two really simple and significant problems with that system. One is people who are really wealthy can buy their way out, even if they're dangerous, even if public safety demands that they be held in custody, simply because they have access to money. People like Jeffrey Epstein, people who may have committed or been accused of committing some of the most egregious crimes, In fact, some of you who are victims' rights advocates may have heard of a law, which is California's Victims' Bill of Rights. So it's called Marsy's Law. It was named after a woman, a young woman, who was murdered by her ex-boyfriend. Well, one of the rights that victims have, thanks to Marsy's Law, is a right to be notified when the accused in their case is bailed out or is released. And the reason for that right, the reason that got written into our state's Victims' Bill of Rights is because the person who murdered Marsy, who was later convicted of murdering her, who later died in prison because of his murder of his ex-girlfriend, was wealthy. And he bailed his way out of jail. And he showed up at her funeral to taunt and harass her family. Money bail made that possible. And it also makes it possible for poor people who present no public safety risk, but who have children at home, who have jobs, who have bills to pay, to languish behind bars, not because they're dangerous or because they present a risk to society, but simply because of their poverty. We replaced a wealth-based system with a risk-based system. And I was proud to be the first jurisdiction in the country to have an across-the-board ban on any one of my lawyers asking a court to impose money bail at arraignment.
That's how it works. I have so many questions, and there's so many questions that are coming through from every directions. But I didn't want to leave tonight without talking about the election and just what your thoughts are on the election. I mean, now that you've been on the ballot, and I don't know if that's changed how things look or how things feel to you. But what are you noticing these days as the tension starts to ramp up a little bit as we prepare for the November elections?
Well, last year was my first time being on the ballot, being a candidate. That's
what I was thinking.
Yeah, I learned a ton being on the campaign trail. It was obviously a local race, not a statewide or national one, but it does give me a different perspective as we ramp up for a really historic election on November 3rd. I've been doing everything I can to help make sure it's safe to vote in San Francisco, to make sure people know that it's safe. Unfortunately, there's a lot of fear-mongering coming out of Washington right now, trying to undermine people's confidence in the electoral process. And I'm proud to say that my office is working really closely with other city agencies, including the Department of Elections, to ensure that everyone who wants to vote in San Francisco can do so safely, can do so freely, can do so conveniently. And I think we're really ahead of the curve when it comes to other jurisdictions in terms of being prepared for what could be a really contentious election day in some parts of the country. But I'll also tell you, I know there are candidates all across the country, from the President of the United States and the candidates for that office, all the way down to the smallest local races, school board or college board, who are working their tail off in these last 22 days to get voters' attention, to just get on people's radar and get their message and their story out there. And I would just encourage people who are watching to take the time to educate yourself. There's so many important races, and we can't always control the outcome of national races. We don't have the power, even that they have in a state like, say, Ohio or Pennsylvania, to shape the outcome of the presidential race. But we do have tremendous power over what happens at the local level, and so much change, so much important innovation in policy is happening at the local level. And it'll be all the more important that a place like San Francisco has creative, hardworking, ethical elected officials if we don't take back the White House in November. And so I just would really encourage folks, pay attention to all the races on the ballot, to all the propositions, take the time to educate yourself, have conversations with friends and family, get out there and phone bank to make sure people or you can access in states like Arizona and Colorado and Michigan are going to show up to vote. It's a critical part of our civic duty. It's something, I know it feels a little bit trite and maybe oversaid, but our ancestors really fought and died for this right. And it's something that is easy to take for granted, and we've got to stop taking it for granted because we may lose it. And I think there's a lot that's at stake in this very election.
Me too. When we meet in person and do the forum in person, Rebecca takes gives note cards to everybody in the audience. Everybody writes their questions, and then she gives me the questions. So she's sending me some of the questions right now. We have a zillion questions, as you've already mentioned. Here's one of the questions. I worry that justice isn't being served for the hundreds dying of fentanyl ODs and their families, and the residents of the Tenderloin and their kids who have to watch drug use and drug dealings. Could you comment?
I totally agree. We've got a crisis of historic proportions, and you don't need to go any further than Golden Gate and Hyde to see it playing out in front of you. It's right here in the middle of our city, in the heart of our city, and it's a neighborhood that's not just any neighborhood. It's not, it's not just, it's the Tenderloin, and so we can write it off. The Tenderloin happens to be the neighborhood with the highest concentration of families with small kids, of schools, of school-age children. It's a tremendously vibrant community full of immigrants in different languages and different cultures, and we need to do a better job than we're doing. Just no question about that. How we get there is, like so much public policy, complicated. Now, I think a first necessary step, and this is one that's not in my control. This is one that I've been advocating for at City Hall, but I don't have control of this. A necessary step is to ensure that people who are drug addicted, who are abusing drugs, who are using drugs in ways that result in overdoses, or that result in the kind of really tragic behavior we see playing out on the streets all too often in front of families and children, have access to 24/7 treatment on demand. We need to get serious about helping people who are abusing drugs reduce their dependence, reduce their abuse, and get their lives back on track. That's one thing we don't do nearly enough of as a city. There are long waits for people who want to get into sober living environments, who want to get into residential treatment facilities, and we need to make sure that it's easier to get help than it is to get high. Another thing we need to do a much better job of, and this is something that I talk to the San Francisco Police Department command staff about every day that we have our meetings. Every time we have our meetings, we're talking about this issue, is we need to be more effective at upstream enforcement. We need to start getting some law enforcement on suppliers, not just on the street level dealers, but on the big supply chain. We need to make some of the arrests that net us kilos, not just crumbs. Most of the cases, in fact, almost all of the cases that my office gets presented by the San Francisco Police Department are street level dealers with very, very small volumes of drugs. So it's a critical problem if we're serious about changing the paradigm. There are some folks who ask me to prosecute more cases, more drug sales cases. And I want to be really clear about what my values are and also about what we're doing. My values are based on a historic understanding of the horrific failure of the war on drugs. It has not worked. It will not work. Nevertheless, when police bring me a drug sales case, my office prosecutes it as a felony more than 85% of the time. We are prosecuting drug sales cases, but it's not working for the same reasons that the war on drugs didn't work anywhere else. And if you think that the answer is to be harsher and tougher on crime, the US attorney tried doing that at the end of last year. The US attorney prosecuted 30 or 40 people that the San Francisco Police Department brought him. And every single one of those people who was convicted was deported. They were sent out of this country, and it didn't make a dent to the accessibility of drugs, to the purity of drugs, to the low cost of drugs. It didn't solve the problem for the same reasons that the war on drugs has failed. So I am absolutely mortified at what we see playing out in our streets. But I will tell you, simply arresting more people and at the street level and sending them to jail for longer is not going to solve the problem. We need more serious enforcement upstream, and we need much more serious support for people trying to kick their habits.
Here's a question. I witnessed an example of police brutality against an elderly Black woman who was experiencing a medical issue. And I already submitted a complaint, but I'm wondering what else can be done to address the issue.
It really depends on the specifics. Depending on where you submitted your complaint, I would recommend in a situation like that going first to the Department of Police Accountability. They have an online complaint submission form. It makes it very easy for anyone to submit complaints. They will actually do a follow-up investigation. It takes a while, usually takes about a year to complete their investigation. Now, if you believe what you saw amounts to criminal activity, not just a policy violation, then you can refer that incident to my independent investigation bureau, and I'll put the link in the chat window in a moment. We have a dedicated bureau that is pretty unique in law enforcement. And San Francisco is really the leader in the country in this regard. We have a team that focuses exclusively on investigating police use of force cases. We have a detailed memorandum of understanding with the police department that allows us to play the lead role in investigating officer use of force. But we're not always notified of these incidents. We don't always have the information to do the investigation. So if you saw something you believe was criminal, reach out to our independent investigation bureau. I'll put the link up in a second. And certainly start with a Department of Police accountability report. You can always also, let me see if I can put this in for everyone here. So link to our team, and there's contact information and other info there, I believe, on that link. You can always also report up the chain to the particular captain. So if it was something that happened in the Tenderloin, you could reach out to the Tenderloin captain to make sure it's on their radar at the command staff as well. But certainly, we want to reduce excessive force. We want to reduce use of force and the need for people to use, for police department personnel to use force. So anything we can do as a community to increase transparency and accountability, obviously really critical now more than ever.
Here's another question that was sent in. I assume the SFDA's office on its own doesn't have the authority, ability, or budget to implement all the necessary elements of restorative justice. How should San Francisco voters evaluate your performance as DA and restorative justice as a public policy and program, given the limitations of your office?
That's exactly right. We don't, and we're also not necessarily the best ones to implement all of the components of restorative justice. Community-based organizations often have the tools, the independence, the credibility to do that work. We farm cases out where appropriate to those partners. So we work closely with a group called Impact Justice, for example, a group called Community Works West, for example, and they do a lot of the heavy lifting on restorative justice cases. That being said, I want to correct what might be a little bit of a misconception that I heard in the question, and I could be reading too much into it, but the restorative justice was one part of my campaign platform. It was by no means intended to apply to every single case. I view restorative justice primarily as a victims' rights issue. And my goal and my campaign promise was that before my term was up, we would try to give every victim of every crime the right to participate in a restorative justice process if they choose to. We're not there yet, and we certainly don't have a budget to allow us to do that right now. We are applying for grants. We're seeking outside funding that the city won't give us or can't give us. And we're also seeking community-based partners like the ones I mentioned to help do some of the work, because I have a team of lawyers who are really capable at presenting evidence to a jury, at trying a case in front of a judge or a jury. They don't have the skills, and nor do I necessarily want them to all develop the skills to mediate a restorative justice process. Those can be separate tracks for separate cases, and right now it's driven primarily by what the crime victim wants and needs.
Here's a question. What are your thoughts on how or what we might do to ensure due process and fair treatment of mentally ill offenders? And maybe you can talk about just the issue of mental illness in San Francisco and in our time,
It's a huge challenge for public safety, for civil rights, and also for how we think about and conceive of culpability in the context of criminal acts. The county jail is the #1 provider of mental health services in the city. Now, you don't need to be a psychiatrist or a psychologist to know that a jail is not a good place to provide mental health services. But it's been the #1 place for our mental health services for years. About 75% of the people booked into San Francisco County Jail are abusing substances, have behavioral health issues, or both. We know that a significant driver of criminal activity, of contacts with the police, is either substance use or behavioral health challenges that are untreated or undertreated in the community. If we can figure out how to treat these problems upstream before crimes are committed, not only are we being more effective in our intervention, not only are we being more humane in our treatment of people who have really serious and often poorly understood mental health challenges, but we're also preventing there from being another crime victim. Right now, the approach is just wait for these folks who we see in crisis on the streets every day, wait for them to commit a crime that's serious enough that we can hold them in custody for years or send them to state prison. That is not a good approach. It's not fair to people who need help, and it guarantees that there will be a victim who suffers a serious harm before we intervene. So I'm a big proponent of Mental Health SF, an initiative that Supervisors Haney and Ronan played a leadership role on, that I know Mayor Breed is also involved in supporting at this stage. And I would love to see San Francisco get serious about funding mental health services so that we're not waiting for people to commit a serious crime before they get the interventions that are so obviously needed.
Yeah, there's never a time I go out without seeing somebody who's severely mentally ill, and it breaks my heart too, just to think of their family and them. They seem so vulnerable too. To just, I wish there was more that we could do for them. It seems like a very severe problem in our city.
Absolutely.
Here's a question: How do we encourage people to access available safe tent locations?
So last year on the campaign trail, a lot of people said to me and the other candidates, what are you going to do about homelessness? And I want to be really clear. I think that we have an obvious and urgent housing crisis in this city. It is not a criminal problem. It is not a problem for the district attorney's office to deal with. We have city agencies that focus exclusively on housing and on homelessness. We've got lots of them, and it's their job to solve the problem. I have no control over housing, over homeless shelter funding, or over any of those related things. And there are some folks who have encouraged me and other prosecutors to treat tent encampments as criminal violations. But that's actually not just a question of discretion. It's also a question of constitutional law. The United States Circuit Court for the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, the federal appeals court that governs the entire west coast of the United States, issued an opinion in a case out of Idaho a couple of years ago that makes it very clear, as a matter of constitutional law, we are prohibited from prosecuting people from setting up tent or camping out in the city unless we can prove that there were available homeless shelter beds when they set up their tent. And we can't prove that because San Francisco is chronically under-resourced when it comes to homeless shelter beds. Our city has to get serious about building shelter capacity, about expanding existing shelters and building new ones, or we have to tolerate tent encampments all over our city. It's not a good solution for businesses, for homeowners that have camps in front of their driveways or their storefronts. All of us are frustrated. And I can tell you that other cities like New York City, for example, that have big homeless populations, have enough shelter beds for every single unhoused person in their city. We don't. If we don't solve that problem, we're going to continue to have tents in places we'd rather not have them. And I'm prohibited by federal constitutional law from prosecuting people for setting up tents until and unless we have excess shelter capacity.
Thank you. There's two ballot propositions about bail on the ballot this year. Could you talk a little bit about them and what your perspective is on them?
Yeah, there's a couple really exciting criminal justice reform initiatives underway at the local and state level. I believe the initiatives you're referring to are Proposition 22 and Proposition 25, if I'm getting the question correctly. Proposition 22 is, for me, a really strong and obvious no vote. And I'll tell you why. Proposition 22 is basically trying to repeal several years worth of progressive criminal justice reforms that have worked. They've worked to reduce crime statewide. They've worked to reduce racial disparities. They've worked to safely decarcerate. And they've worked to give law enforcement additional different tools, for example, to incentivize people who are incarcerated to engage in programming. We don't want to undo those reforms. There's no reason to undo those reforms because they've been successful by virtually any metric statewide. So I'm a strong proponent of a no vote on Proposition 22. The one that specifically deals with bail is much more complicated for me. It's Proposition 25, and it's essentially a referendum on Senate Bill 10, which was a law passed in 2018, signed into law by then Governor Brown, but never took effect because the bail bond industry wanted to kill it, gathered enough signatures to put it on the ballot, and here we are voting on it in the next couple of weeks. I have and could easily spend a couple hours talking about the complexities of this issue. To be very brief and succinct, my official position on Proposition 25 is neutral, and I'll tell you why in a nutshell. I think that Senate Bill 10 and a yes vote would have Senate Bill 10 take effect. Senate Bill 10 was a very, very fraught and problematic piece of legislation. I opposed it in its final form and urged members of the Assembly to vote no. So it's hard for me to now vote yes on a bill that I had very good reasons for opposing at the time. By the same token, the bail industry is the main driving force behind why this is even on the ballot in the first place. And Senate Bill 10, for all of its flaws, would effectuate the end of money bail. And I've already talked earlier tonight about why money bail is so problematic. I'm not going to repeat those points. But I would love to see the end of money bail statewide. I would love to see all of California move towards a risk-based system rather than a wealth-based system for pretrial detention. And so I am officially neutral on the bill. I think in either event, whether Proposition 25 succeeds or whether it fails, we have a lot more work to do to fix the problems in pretrial detention.
Great. You know, it seems like we just started a minute ago, and I can't believe it's time to wrap up. We just try to keep everything on time. But I had so many more questions for you about specific things. And I had questions too, just about how religious organizations can support the role of social justice in our city. And so I think next time we get together, we'll talk more about that. But to wrap up, I would love to hear just what signs of hope you see. I talk to so many people, and they're in the sense of despair from friends who've been sick with COVID and the terrible things that happen in terms of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd's murder, and then we had the terrible conflagration in California where the whole state was on fire, and then we had this election too where the president says he may not go along with whatever the result is. So what do you see that kind of gives you hope and that you're sharing with people who are despairing?
We have been through the unthinkable this year. As a world, as a country, as a state, and as a city. We've faced challenges we never could have predicted or imagined. We've suffered losses that will stay with us for years and decades to come. Almost all of us have either been directly impacted or at least know someone who has been gravely ill with COVID, who's lost a home because of the fires raging across the state. And every single one of us is in fear, I think, some level of anxiety over the future of our democracy as we approach an election where, as you say, one entire party is really undermining the prospect of a safe transition of power. It is a difficult time. It's a time where it's easy to see why people would be living in fear, why pessimism could take over, and why dark clouds would kind of shroud the horizon. I'm hopeful. I'm optimistic. And I'll tell you why. Crisis creates opportunities. And it is these kinds of crises, whether it be the fire, whether it be the electoral situation, whether it be COVID-19, that while yes, they impose horrific costs and make us suffer and we, as I say, experience losses that we never dreamed of. They also force us to make changes, to adapt, and to set down a better course and path for the future. They allow us to find policy solutions and innovations that we might not have otherwise found. They bring us together in ways that nothing else could. And I will tell you, simply looking at my office and the staff who I'm proud to lead in the San Francisco District Attorney's Office, what we have done in this period, the ways in which we've rallied together, the efforts we've made to innovate and be creative and stay on top of our caseload, even as courts shut down, even as we have constantly changing landscapes for technology and court appearances and crime trends and interaction with our closest law enforcement partners, have been inspiring. I look at what we've done as a city, the ways in which we've navigated this crisis more successfully, arguably, than almost any other major city in the country. And there is reason for hope. We are at our best when we are facing adversity. We are at our most creative when we are facing unprecedented challenges. And you look around and you see what we've accomplished, and you see how much room there is for improvement and opportunity for change and for growth. And I have to believe, because I'm a humanist at core, because I believe in people, because I believe in our struggle to survive and to thrive together as a social enterprise, that we will emerge from 2020 stronger and wiser and healthier.
I'm a humanist at core too. I do have a lot of faith in human beings, especially when we're connected with one another. I'm very grateful for you taking the time to talk to us tonight. It's been such a blessing to have you. Please join me next week when my guest will be Laura Bazelon, attorney, professor, and director of the Criminal and Juvenile Justice and Racial Justice Clinics at the University of San Francisco, and author of Rectify, The Power of Restorative Justice After Wrongful Conviction. You can help bring the arts to life at Grace with a gift to the forum. Please visit gracecathedral.org/give to give to Grace. And thanks again so much, Chesa, for being with us. Our prayers are with you and all the people who are trying to support the city during this very challenging time. So thank you for visiting this time, and we'll look forward to seeing you in person when the doctors let us.
Sounds great. I'll look forward to it. Thanks for all the work you do, and I look forward to partnering with you and all the other leadership in our faith-based communities to make San Francisco a safer place for all of us. Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.